Stephen Kutcher. There's no one else on the planet quite like you, and I'm thrilled to have you for a discussion about insects, entomophilia, and filmmaking, because your life has beautifully segued into Hollywood in all manner of ways. And your work appears in, and you sent me a long list that I'd love to probe and discuss during the time we have together. But first, how would you introduce yourself and what motivates you and what you do?
I'm a very curious person. Steve Kutcher is a very curious person. He's always asking questions.
In the third person.
Well, there are a number of me because, I'm too big for one person.
Indeed.
So I'm curious, and I like to know how things work and how the world works. And one of the ways to explore the world is to explore nature, because nature is part of the earth. It's very rare in the universe, and it's evolved over millions of years. And so that means where we are with nature has become very sophisticated. We're not just dealing on a simplistic level. And so I wanted to explore nature, and one of the easiest ways to explore nature is to explore something that is found in nature wherever nature exists, and that's insects. And when I realized what an entomologist was, I said, I want to be one of those. But when I was little, I also liked to draw. And so from a very early age, art was always part of what I did. Now, I have to admit, it was rather primitive, and I was influenced by World War II, so I would draw, war scenes as sometimes, not all the time. And I didn't have, even though I had an uncle who was an artist and gave me my first watercolors, I would use the phone book, and I would go through the phone book and look at moving vans and things like that. And when I was born in New York, and in the city, that you're not exposed to too many insects, but my parents would take me to the Catskill Mountains every summer, and there were fireflies and all kinds of wonderful things in the Catskill Mountains. And I became really intrigued. So that evolved into me becoming an entomologist. So I decided to follow that track. So in elementary school, I made bug collections. In high school, I made more bug collections, did bug reports. And then I eventually went to Davis and got my bachelor's, and I studied insect behavior, and I became intrigued with insect behavior, and followed through that with my master's at Long Beach State, where insect behavior, ecology, and botany were things that influenced me, where I seemed to put my emphasis, especially field biology. And I graduated with my master's and MA in biology. And one day I still hung around the museum, and one day my major professor said, they're making this movie called The Exorcist 2, and they need somebody to take care of 10,000 African locusts. Well, it wasn't something I had ever done before, but it would be something that I would find interesting. And I had no idea, just going in. I had done comedy on the radio previously, playing bug songs on the radio, #1 on the Bug Bus 40, and doing things like that. But I was thrown into a major feature film, and I had to figure things out. And I had one advantage, and that advantage was that I studied insect behavior because I knew how insects would behave. And people that were making the movie didn't know anything about insects. I mean, they couldn't tell a grasshopper from a beetle, probably. But I had to have temperature requirements, light requirements, cage requirements, all the things I needed. But what I was learning, because I knew that part, but what I was learning was the movie part of it, because the movie part was something I had never been exposed to. So I didn't know how the director worked. I didn't know how the director of photography worked. I didn't know about lighting. I didn't know about grips. I went to pick up something and move it, and they say, you can't do that. This is for union people. I'm going, okay, that's fine. And so I worked on that movie for over 6 months, and it was, I met different stars. I had my picture taken with some of them. I learned a lot about how movies are made, because this is back in the day of film. So if you shot something, you had to wait 24 hours for the film to come back to see what they call dailies. So you could see, oh, was that take good? Because you didn't know. Nowadays, it's all digital, instantly, and they're editing right away. So I did that movie, and then it ended up being 3,000 African locusts instead of 10,000, and I grew flats of ryegrass to feed them. But I had to do things like they wanted the grasshoppers, the locusts, to be on one side of the cage. So when James Earl Jones taps the cage, they will flutter. So I had them put studio lights, because I knew the locusts were attracted to the heat, on one side of the cage, and then they pulled the lights away, and James Earl Jones comes over and he taps it, and the locusts fly in the cage. So I had to use my knowledge to do that. Then my next job,
Can I
which I thought
interject?
that's yeah.
So this was your first experience, major Hollywood film, Exorcist 2. 6 months sounds like a luxury to me when I think in terms of how quickly television or film operates. I would have expected them to naively contact you and say, we need these insects within the week. We're going to wrap it up. But you had half a year.
Well, what happened was, okay, uh, um, John Borman, the director, in one of the scenes, they had wind machines blowing dust, and he got valley fever, and they had to shut the movie down. So it wasn't a full 6 months. And there were a couple of other delays that caused the movie to go into hiatus for a bit. But I had to keep the locusts alive. I couldn't go out and collect new ones.
Gotcha.
So my job was collecting, was keeping them as healthy as I could. And then I also knew that it's always good to save stuff. So when they died, because I'd go into these big cages, and I would go through and I'd take out the dead locusts, because you'd always find dead locusts. And I'd put them in the freezer, because later on there was a scene that didn't show, and they wanted locusts to smash against the wall and leave blood splats. So I and my friend injected these with studio blood, which is caro syrup and food coloring, and so we had all these frozen locusts and injected them with studio blood, and then everybody got a handful, and when the director said now, they all threw them against the wall. So that's and then they said, okay, we're done with primary shooting, but we might do some pickup shots. And I said to them, well, can I take the locusts? The locusts were on the studio. I said, can I take them at home and I'll take care of them, no charge. But if you decide to use them again, then you pay for it. So I kept maybe a couple of hundred that I had in my tiny little apartment.
Mhm.
And that was kind of cool too.
And
But
you,
that's why the 6 months.
gotcha. And so behind you, we get a little glimpse of your arthropod zoo.
Right.
At that time, had you accrued a mini zoo, or was this the first
Uh,
hint?
I've always had insects with me. I mean, if you don't have insects in your home, what is life?
Right.
So, so you have to always have them around. Plus the fact I use them in my artwork, so I need to have my artist colony. So the assistant director on The Exorcist 2 um, worked on Wonder Woman, which was a major TV show, and they needed carpenter ants, the same carpenter ants that were dropped off at your door, Campanotus,
Yeah.
and and so there are stories about how we went out and collected the ants and brought them back and tore the logs apart. Anyway, I did that job, the Wonder Woman episode, and I thought, well, that's the end of that. And then I'd start getting calls every once in a while until finally I was working on a commercial and, and the hand model, there was a hand model there, said, you ought to advertise yourself in LA 411. And so I did, and I started getting more work. But in the early 80s, I figured out, I sat down and I said, I wonder how many insects are in film. Because I knew there's a famous scene in Potemkin um, where the crew is revolting Battleship Potemkin because there's maggoty meat.
Right.
And so I was exposed to that. And I guess that thought kind of permeated through. I wonder how many insects are in film. Well, that isn't something you can look up.
Mhm.
So I got a journal and I just kept track of the films I saw and whether there was an insect or an entomologist would be needed for that. And I discovered that 1 out of every 3 films had a bug in it. And I saw the work potential there.
Mm.
So
And not
so that
and
was
and I'm
my,
guessing not trivial cameos. No, that Battleship Potemkin scene you're mentioning was brief, but it's one of the very few I saw that decades ago, and that was one of the few scenes that stick vividly in my
oh
memory.
yeah, because it's so powerful.
Mhm.
I mean, the way he filmed it, it's a powerful scene. Um, Art Evans, uh, in the movie I made, Art Evans talks about, I forget the name of the movie, um, and because he was asked how did you get interested in entomology? And he said, I asked him that. I said, how did you get interested in entomology? And he said, when he was a young boy, he was interested, but he saw this movie and I found a still of it. And I sent Art the still of the movie and it had an ant farm in it. And he became intrigued by that. I could look it up if you want to know the name.
Mhm.
But it was a black and white old film.
Mhm.
And that had nothing to do with ants. There just happened to be an ant farm in there and a young boy in the ant farm. And he said that really affected him. And he started studying ants and getting
Mm.
books on ants in the library. And so that triggered him.
Oh, even though in that case it was potentially just a small cameo and not a central focus
Right,
of the film, it still
right.
affected. a really amazing coleopterous beetle researcher's life.
Right, right. So I um, was still thinking about getting my PhD, and I had been exposed to Hollywood and the money you make in Hollywood. And I was also teaching at that time at a community college, and I saw the money I was making at teaching. And I said, wow, it took me all those years to get my master's degree, and I'm making little money, and I can be the, you know next to nothing, and I can make this money in Hollywood. Except that I didn't realize that all the behavioral entomology that I learned were, fit the job that I was doing. If I didn't have that background, if I didn't know how to CO2 insects to put them to sleep, if I didn't know all the things we learn, um, I would have been like the dog and cat trainers.
Let's go into that application of your experience with insects and insect behavior and applying that in, say, some case-by-case scenarios, case studies in Hollywood, and then think larger picture about visions of insects in popular media. So, for example, what would be some cases, if you could walk us through an example, as you did with the locusts being attracted to the warmth, to the light, to the heat, that plays out in Back to the Future 2, Badass Bugs, Blind Fury, The Burbs, Captain Nuke and the Bomber Boys, Cherry 2000, Clifford and Cold, in the long list of films and TV shows that you've been involved with. Let's pull some salient examples.
Well,
Or shall I pull a random one out to see where
no,
you go?
because the random ones, some of these were just kind of, you know, um, I I think I just sent you the list,
Mm-hmm.
but I have in my list, I don't know if you see these dots.
Yeah.
I marked films with that, like some are pretty much a non-event essentially, where others have six.
Well, Stephen,
So I'm
let's.
guessing there are about 25, 30 maybe stories, well, 40 stories out of the 100 films that I would have, that I could tell you. So I'll tell you a few.
So first, humor us with an example of a non-event. Like, when would a director or producer go out of their way to hire you for something you're considering a non-event?
In the movie Contact,
Mm-hmm.
1997, they just wanted a cockroach to sit somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a matter of chilling down the cockroach so it wouldn't go away, and then placing it wherever they wanted to put it.
So let's take that as a good case study. What are the options? They could have this was Periplaneta americana, American cockroach.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so they could have found one of those dead, placed the dead specimen in place, or they could have tried to film a live one, or they could have taken a rubber one, or they could have had someone build one, make one, right? Or today, computer graphics. So there are a lot of potential options. How did you fit in at that time, and why did they call you?
Well, first you have to take CG off the table because they didn't exist. So you couldn't computer generate it. A dead one would look like a dead one. So you take that off the table. But you run into, when you deal with a live one, they don't know how to do it because, they're filmmakers. They're not cockroach handlers. And then they don't think about, you have to make sure that the insect, and they might have used a hissing cockroach for that. I really don't
Hmm.
remember. I'd have to go back and look at the film. But they, you don't want it to escape. So they don't think about that at all.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, okay, they're going to do a second take. So if I place the cockroach somewhere, you don't want it to run off. And now we're spending time looking for the cockroach, or it climbs up somebody's pant leg, and now we're dealing with that. So I have to, I'm the person who knows, and I always think of whatever I'm doing as a stage, how to place the insect on that stage so that it will do the actions that I want it to do for the camera.
Mhm.
Another problem could be, so they're using studio lights, and it could be 140 or 150 degrees, the lights on the
Mm.
surface, because they're heating up this surface. So I learned to use my hand and just place my hand wherever the insect was going to be, because if my hand was comfortable, I knew the insect would be comfortable.
Can I
If
share
my
an
hand was hot,
yeah? Can I share an historical anecdote with you?
yeah.
So Ladislav Starovich, who was one of the first stop motion animators and was the first to have impose a
Oh,
narrative.
yeah.
His first film, which was I think only a couple minutes long, doesn't exist, lost to history, but he apparently animated dead beetles that were battling each other. So they had wire limbs and actual bodies, the dead bodies that he would frame by frame move in a battle sequence as he was working at a natural history museum. So he did that, according to his granddaughter, because when he had the hot camera lights on the live specimens, they just wouldn't behave.
Right, right. And see, that that is the problem that can exist. I did a little side, I did a commercial where I have a praying mantis uh, um, uh, using on a bicycle wheel, and his legs are going like this. And what I did was I took the praying mantis. I didn't use metal or anything. I took the praying mantis that had died, and its limbs were still flexible, and I attached them to the pedals. And so when the pedals turned, his legs went up and down, and you could see that. But it's knowing how to do that stuff. You and I would figure out this. If you were me, you would have done many of the same things that I did, because you would have understand that, or you would have learned how to do it. You would have solved the problem and figured it out. And not everybody can do that.
How many insect or arachnid wranglers for film or TV show do you think exist in the world that devote or invest much of their professional efforts to what you have?
I would say there were really only two, me and Ray Mendez.
Ah,
But in terms of people who handle insects, there there may be a few dozen, because they're basically either reptile people or dog and cat people, or we do everything people. And it doesn't take much in the way, once you understand animals, to put a tarantula down and have it walk. However, they don't know what I know. And so the cheaper person who says, oh, I could get a tarantula, I could get a cockroach. And let me give you another side one about the cockroach.
sure.
This is in Pacific Heights. In Pacific Heights, there's a scene. Um, I was working on arachnophobia, so I couldn't. And my friend Madeline Klein, who's going to be at my birthday party, and she's going to do the dog act. And and she, uh, I let her handle my business. But what was so interesting is she trains tigers and chimps, and she had a pet buffalo, and she does. she could do all this stuff, but she didn't have a background with insects. And that's how we met and became very close friends. Because I was flying a butterfly in a string. She said, if you teach me how to do that, I'll let you take my 300-pound tiger for a walk. And that was an amazing experience. But Madeline and I became very close friends. We're still close friends. So I sent her up to San Francisco to do Pacific Heights. So she did the cockroaches underneath the sink. And then they wanted to do a pickup shot. And I know I'm forgetting his name, very famous actor who's in Pacific Heights, one of the stars. And they wanted to put a cockroach on his face. So I was getting my cockroaches from the lab at UCR. And Madeline calls me and said, they want to get a cockroach. How much should I charge them? And I said, $2,000. And she said, because animal trainers work for like, then maybe it was $400, $500 a day. And I said, $2,000. And so she says, they're going to think I'm crazy. I said, you tell them this. They can send some PAs out to the sleaziest alleys they can find and get the most disease-ridden cockroaches they can pick up. Or I will send them clean cockroaches you can put on its face.
Hand-fed.
Right. So I learned how to do that in the movie industry because, if they want something, they'll pay for it.
And do you find that the writers, directors, those involved in these productions run the gamut of, we just want a bug that will scare the audience, to this will be metaphorically, symbolically important, and really understand the context that might be insect specific, species specific?
It's both, but this is what I found, that some writer gets a hold of an encyclopedia and goes through, finds insects and goes, oh, this is a cool insect. Let's get that one. And so that's what comes to me. And I'll say, okay, let's just mosey over to Brazil for a couple of days.
In hopes of finding an rainforest near Manaus.
Right. So I can say, but I can do this. And when it gets to that other stage, this is really science and art to the extreme, where like in, I think it was Leprechaun 2 or 3, whatever is on that list, they said, we want this leprechaun character to have some cockroaches. And I said, why don't you make them green? Green? Said, yeah, I can make them green. And so I painted them white with acrylic, which comes off fairly easily. And then I painted green over the white. So the cockroaches, American cockroaches, were green. So I had to know about art as well as entomology, as well as the movie industry, to put that whole thing together. I did the same thing.
I wonder if that painting of cockroaches predates Catherine Chalmers' painting of American cockroaches in her art. The cover of Art News one issue actually featured one of her works of a live American cockroach painted different colors.
Let's see, Leprechaun.
Leprechaun 2, 1991 or 1994 release.
Yeah. So that's when I did that. So, but you would have figured that out. But it's the fact that I took their information, cockroaches, and took it to the next level. And I did the same thing in James and the Giant Peach. And James and the Giant Peach, which Tim Burton did. And, I know I won't do it, but I really want to write Tim Burton a letter, because recently he wrote something that AI is stealing his characters and and Tim Burton said the artwork looks good, but it has no soul.
Mm.
And I wanted to say the same thing with insects, that when they CG insects, it can look pretty good, but it doesn't have the behavior. It doesn't have what people who look at insects and really know. Okay, so because we talked about Leprechaun 2 and painting the cockroaches, I started to say I used the same thing in James and the Giant Peach, which Tim Burton did. That's why I got off on the Tim Burton story. And in the beginning of the film, it's live action, and they wanted a live spider, to be on a plant where the young boy comes and collects the spider off the plant. And so it turned out that I knew somebody at UCR who had just described a new dwarf tarantula. And I thought, oh, that'll be perfect. A dwarf tarantula, it's small, you put it on the plant. I asked him, I said, any problem with envenomization or anything? He said, no, nothing beyond the norm. And so I said to them, well, I could get this spider, send him a picture, but the rest of the film, most of the film is animated. And in James and Giant Peach, if you remember the spider, it had striped abdomen.
Mm.
And I said, I can make the spider look like that spider.
Mm.
And so they made a little prosthesis, a plastic prosthesis that fit over the abdomen and had a Velcro strap. So that when you looked at the spider, you saw the front of the spider looks like the regular spider, but the abdomen was this black and white striped abdomen. You should look at the pictures of James and Giant Peach, you'll see it. So that's another example. In this case, we didn't paint it, but I had to know how to put the prosthesis on the spider so the spider would act normally. And I've done this a number of other times with other insects, where I put, for a Bud Light commercial, I put a prosthesis on, they wanted an elephant cricket, something that doesn't exist. So they made this elephant head with tusks, and I put it on a Jerusalem cricket and had the Jerusalem cricket crawl.
When you place the prosthesis on, and you say you've done this with more than one example, you're doing it in such a way as to not encumber the motion and normal behavior. It still surprises me that the spider wouldn't incessantly groom.
So, okay, and you would do the same thing. You look at the insect, you go, okay, what are the inputs? What are the sensory inputs? So if you cover the eyes, that's going to be a problem. Cover the antenna, it's going to be a problem. If you cover the hairs, the sensory hairs, it's going to be a problem. I could take your colony of bees, and I can make them look like green yellow jackets.
And in science, what do I do? What did I do this summer? I painted dots on the back of a bee that she was busily feeding on sugar water, and barely even turned as I'd paint individual paint marks so that I could distinguish one bee from the next. So that's a good point.
And I know that you could paint the entire dorsal surface of the thorax, and it wouldn't make any difference to the bee. But if you painted a leg, that might create an issue.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Going from a pisthosoma back portion of the body of one spider to another, you painted the spider, Tobey Maguire's spider that caused the radioactive. Yeah.
Okay, so when I was approached with that, I wanted to do the same thing, even though the spider was really tiny, a very small spider, and was also its abdomen could be easily punctured. It wasn't that sturdy. I uh, I wanted to put a prosthesis on it, but they wouldn't give me the budget or the time to
Mm.
develop one that I could put on. Because I envisioned, instead of using a Velcro strap, using something like white glue or something that I could dissolve off, but make it fit over the abdomen.
Mhm.
And then you could mass produce these little things so that all you had to do was put it on. And it they wouldn't give me the time to do that. So I had to go to plan B. Plan B is painting the spider. And I probably came up with the idea too, I'm sure I did, of why don't you make it Spider-Man
Red,
colors?
blue.
Right, red and blue. So I met this wonderful, fabulous guy who could paint really tiny things. He was an excellent artist. I gave him a tarantula. He gave me one of the children's books. And he's one of these unsung hero types who worked on, he was just a painter on the stage that would paint sets and stuff. But he had this micro paintbrush. And so what we did was we take the spider, put it on some foam, um, and restrict its movements. Spider was fine, didn't hurt the spider. And then use what is that called? It's essentially spray paint. When you use
One
that
airbrush.
airbrush. So we used an airbrush and put on the base color. And it would take him 20 minutes from the time he started. Take the spider, put him down, put on the base coat, and then paint the design. It would take him about 20 minutes. So he painted those spiders and then we'd set them aside. So when I was up on the ladder, Michelle, my assistant, would hand me, she would test the spider first with a pen, make sure it was webbing down. Then when she separated the good spiders from the ones that didn't do it as well, and then she'd hand me a spider, I'd be up on the ladder and then it would web down.
I have colleagues who are arachnologists who were consulted on the film, and they gave me shared personal anecdotes about what they did and what they did not pay attention to. How often do you feel that executive producers, directors pay very close attention to your needs as the arthropod wrangler?
Well, okay, I'll answer that question. But when you said you've spoken to other arachnologists about Spider-Man, here's what I've learned. Movies are for entertainment. They're not for science. You can have pseudoscience and a great movie, and you don't say, oh, but that isn't science. What you want to do is entertain the audience. So I can't tell you how many times I've dealt with things that I know are not the way they are in the real world. But in the fantasy world of film, if
Like
they want a
exploding
spider,
cockroaches in Damnation Alley, for example?
um, yeah,
Okay.
I have some exploding cockroaches, but I keep them in the garage under.
So they do exist. All right.
Yes, yes, but handle with care.
That's right. So
So
sorry to interrupt.
yeah, so that's a whole other thing about the criticism of all the things they've done. But there was and I didn't receive credit in the credits of Spider-Man, but I went beyond what I would normally do because when we shot the laboratory scene, I stayed up for 48 hours straight because they worked day shift, night shift. They only had the museum, it was filmed in the Los Angeles County Museum Natural History. They only had it for the weekend. And so they had a day shift and a night shift. And since it was indoors, they could adjust the lighting. And I stayed up for all four, the day shift, night shift, day shift, night shift. It was exhausting.
Of of all the productions you've participated in, which would you say was the most well-informed and well-intentioned or accurate when it comes to representation of either insects or arachnids?
It really depends on the film. So if the film is a fantasy film, like in Arachnophobia, Frank Marshall, the director, wanted 3 poison glands. I said, in nature, most things are bilateral, and you'd have 2 poison glands if you wanted to create, because they created these little green things. So when he was looking through the microscope, but he wanted 3 of them. So I said, oh, okay, 3 of them. But my job was to tell him what reality is. And that's often what happens, is where they have something, because some films, you want it to be real. In other films, it can be a fantasy, like James and the Giant Peach, or you the goal of the film is to be entertaining, and the real goal is to make money, unfortunately. But the creative part is not so much. It's people like me who are entomologists, who understand the bug part and also have an appreciation for the art and understanding how things, I didn't say to the leprechaun, to people, oh, let's make the cockroaches red or striped or checkered. No, because I knew their theme was green, so it fit right in. And of course, they went for it.
That's an example where your input not only followed the script as they'd hoped, but augmented the scene, right?
Yeah,
Changed the film.
yeah. And so I, in Jurassic Park, for example, they wanted to have a giant mosquito in amber. Well, I was just out of giant mosquitoes, and the mosquito store was closed. So, so, um, so I put together a crane fly, and I used an insect pin for its mouth part, and I made some wings out of plastic, and I attached some legs from another crane fly, because the one that I was working with was missing some legs. So that was then placed in plastic that's amber colored, and that's the one you see on screen.
How many entomologists gave you flack for that?
Well, people still don't point out that it's a crane fly. They still don't, because I think one of the reasons is because the lead up to that is I used Tinarincus, which is the largest mosquito that feeds on other mosquitoes, and I got him from Florida. And the scene before that, which is live, I placed a live chilled mosquito on the bark of a tree and dripped honey down, and the honey gets, traps the mosquito. And you don't see this, they cut away, but in the full thing they filmed, it looked beautiful because the mosquito's sitting there, the honey comes down, surrounds the mosquito, and then you see it tumbling down in the honey as it goes down the bark of the tree. It was beautiful. But I think seeing the live one and then cutting to something that, looks kind of like a mosquito,
Mhm.
people buy off on it.
What were some of your favorite experiences? And are there any examples where you would, in retrospect, disassociate yourself from a film?
Okay, one that I liked was because, oh geez, let me slip in some more movies. In Blind Fury, and then I'll tell you about arachnophobia, but this is a good one. In Blind Fury, um, the actor um, um, sees a wasp flying. He's blind, and he takes out his sword and cuts the wasp in two, and it drops to the ground. Well, the first part I used tarantula hawk, and
Pepsis?
yeah, and I placed it on a little. They didn't do a good job with this. This is where my work was good and their filming was bad. I placed it on a little pedestal that I could move up and down, and I put light on the other side of this area. And so the Pepsis would fly towards the light, and if it flew too low, I would elevate the little stand. If it flew too high, I would lower it because I knew it was flying towards the light.
Mm.
So the camera would fly across the camera, and they got that part. Then the next part was just looking down at the grass, and they wanted both parts of the wasp to drop simultaneously. Well, if you try to do that with your two hands, it's very, very difficult because they'll drop at different times, and they wanted them to come down plunk.
Yeah.
So I took a piece of wood, and I made a branch, and I put one side on one end of the branch and one side on the other, and tilted it, and then they both came down together.
Good.
And so that was a cool moment when I figured that out.
And
Then
oh, please.
Then in arachnophobia, there were so many highlights. I had a cameo in that film, but was when I figured out how to make a spider crawl to a slipper. So
You have a cameo.
yeah, I have a cameo in arachnophobia. So I'll tell you about the cameo, I'll tell you about the thing. And then, one of the things that I can do is just do little snippets. So I'll go through this list and tell you, here's a little bit for this movie, here's a little bit for that.
Yeah,
movie.
I'd love that.
Okay, so in the cameo, so in the scene where the guy who played the entomologist, and unfortunately he's the one who died this year, he wasn't that talkative. I should have spoken to him more and then got a picture together, because he was a nice guy, but he was just kind of standoffish. I think he was trying to do his acting job. Mm-hmm. And I was having too much fun. So Frank Marshall asked me to be in the scene. He said, "You know how to work on a microscope, so go in the background and work on the microscope." and so the entomologist, the arachnologist, goes into the room, and you see a guy going like this, his assistant, and you find out he's playing football. But I'm in the background working on the microscope. So
you're the studious scientist.
Right. And I look up from my microscope. But so that's my little cameo. I got $40 for
that. Wait, so you can bring in a cockroach for $2,000, but you get $40 for actually appearing in the film?
Well, no lines. So, but on that, what was so great, one of the great things was to do problem solving, which I like to do. And how do you make a spider crawl into a slipper from 4 feet away? I had no idea. And it took me 2 weeks, and I figured it out. And what I did was use invisible vibrating wires on either side of the spider. So the camera couldn't see it because it's moving too fast and it's too thin. And it's like a fan. If you look at a fan and the fan is going, when it's stopped, you can say, oh, those are big paddles on the fan. But when it's going, you don't see the paddles. So I just miniaturized that.
Did you hook up the wire to, say, a motor that would vibrate it like this?
It was on a cam.
Ah,
So the cam goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And that makes the wire go up and down, which created a wave motion because it was 4 feet long and the wire would go up and down, but it vibrated so fast you couldn't see it, but the spider could sense it.
and and that was early enough, that was 1990, that you wouldn't have any cleaning up of the film afterwards. And I remember distinctly that lateral view of the spider walking along.
Right. And you didn't see the vibrating wires going
Right.
too fast.
Success story.
Yeah. And
How
that was and my friend who was the special effects guy said, you should be nominated for an Academy Award for, inventing something.
how often after you invent something like that, how often have you reused it or applied it again in a different production?
I maybe once, but it was so difficult because they didn't have the electronics they have now. And
Mm.
so there was a big box of electronics, then there were wires running to the little cam motors, and then you had to hook them up at the other end so you couldn't see them. And, it wasn't just like plopping it down and doing it.
Do you feel, and you can speak personally or just in terms of your profession, is there a place for feeling responsible for your role in a production where you don't feel ethically aligned with the product? So for example, you're an entomophiliac, you love insects, right? But say the message is ultimately insects are bad, destroy insects. Just
No, I
to
don't know.
put a
I
simple
don't have
message
a problem with that. I hate insects.
up.
No, I'll tell you where the issue is that, and you're close, but um, so I get a call to have insects do things for those electronic pest things you plug in and keep bugs away. You
Mhm,
plug them in the wall and then it gets rid of all the insects. But I'm
mhm.
not doing that. I can't see. I think that that's unethical because they don't work, and I don't want to be part of something that doesn't work. On the other hand, if you have vampire bugs from hell attacking little children, I'm there.
Speaking about vampire bugs from hell, you were involved with Dracula, and that
Yeah,
that had an entomophagy scene, eating of
yes,
insects,
with
right?
Tom Waits.
With Tom Waits. Oh my goodness, that's right, of course.
I have a picture. You've never been to my house. If you came to my house, you'd see this wall of pictures with lots of stars and stuff that I have. You'd really enjoy that because they were all insect movies, and these were stars I worked with.
How often do you see themes repeat themselves? Like in movies and television, how often have you been involved with entomophagy or something like destroying of, or as you say, vampires? Are there certain
Yeah.
tropes or themes that you experience over
Oh,
and over again?
you actually know the answer to this. I mean, there are certain things that are cookie cutter type movies, really.
Yeah,
So instead of a dinosaur, you have a whale, or you have a shark, or you have
right.
it could be anything, but it's, the they're they're made for entertainment. I think the creative stuff is what creativity, problem solving, a good script, a unique experience. Those are things that I'm interested in. I enjoyed working with John Carpenter on Prince of Darkness. A chest opens up and thousands of darkling beetles are in the chest, and then then they're down on the ground and crawling around. And so what they did was they made plastic beetles on the ground, and then we put live ones on top. So it made it look like there was more.
Are people advocating for arthropods on screen as they do vertebrates these days?
Well, that you get into the humane thing and stuff, because when you make a film, you can't hurt any living thing in the making of a movie. So you can't swat a fly or kill a cockroach or
And so in that way, the industry has changed. And now you mentioned that some things just don't change. You've got these tropes, whether it's a whale or a leopard or whatever. But do you get the sense that the not just the physical treatment, but the interpretation and presentation of arthropods is changing in films over time?
I think
I suppose it's genre specific, but
I think that opens up a whole other discussion of computer generation, which has taken over my job, to what people are getting. Because if all they see are computer generated stuff and they can't tell the difference between reality and computer generated, then let's just turn it over to AI and forget about, people.
well, that's a good segue. Let's transition to talking about your profession, your job as an arthropod wrangler for popular media. What is the shelf life of such a profession given AI, given computer graphics?
But
And
I don't work much anymore. In
so
the these most of these films were done in the 1990s, early 2000s.
do you see any potential for a resurgence? And before you jump in, I want to give an example of stop motion animation. So Ray Harryhausen was kind of the king of stop motion animation, and he did some arthropods like giant scorpions in Clash of the Titans, the 1981 version. And he did giant bees in Mysterious Island 20 years before that. And when you look at Ray Harryhausen's work, think, wow, that's beautiful, that's brilliant, but there's also a big suspension of disbelief, right? Because you recognize that there's a difference there in Jason and the Argonauts or whatever film you're looking at when they're battling skeletons, that it's not hyper realistic. It's a work of art. And so you say, well, this has all been replaced by computer graphics. So is it relegated to, for example, projects that are quirky, quaint, nostalgia driven? Or is there room for, and you could include those, but is there room for stop motion animation to exist in a beautiful way? You see projects continuing in this vein. And can I make a leap to say that there could be need for and potential resurgence for using actual real dead or alive arthropods in film?
I think that things of the past that were used in the past and popular, like film photography, do you say, oh, film photography, it's been replaced by digital? Nobody uses film anymore, but that's not true.
Tarantino?
People will use film. And I think the same thing in art, the same thing in movie making. And there will be one thing that is missing. People forget, well, there are a number of things, that if an actor holds out his hand and there's supposed to be a butterfly on it, and he's supposed to react to an imaginary butterfly, it's not the same as having a real butterfly there.
Hmm.
And so that's what's being missed, because they can digitally put that butterfly there um, in post.
And you also, hearkening back to early part of the discussion, which I thought was really intriguing, the idea of losing the soul. So if you try to replicate a living organism, say an insect or an arachnid, what does, at least today, where does computer graphics fall flat? And when I watch a film, I have a certain search image, right? I'm used to looking at arthropods. And so just by looking at their gait, their posture, their grooming behavior, whatever they may be exhibiting, I'm used to seeing certain behaviors. So if it doesn't quite match up, or if the anatomy's off, then that will really strike me as, wow, that's artificial and it's unconvincing. And so I'm taken out of the narrative. The story is taken a turn for me. And I could list a bunch of examples. One in the horror genre is Hereditary. And there's a scene where there's a beautiful use of insects, and they're actual insects. And then there's, at least to my eye, a failure in terms of trying to replicate a massive number of flies in the scene. And you know that's computer graphics. So could they have replicated it effectively? It would have been a lot of work. Would it have appealed or appeased the audience more? Maybe only that minuscule portion of the audience that's expecting something based on reality, based on experience with reality.
Well, first of all, and when you're watching a film, if you're distracted by something and say those flies are not real, you're out of the film and the film is not doing its purpose. Mm-hmm. Secondly, there's kind of an between digital and reality, and that's using green screen. So you use live things in green screen, and then you paint them in. It normally isn't as good, but that's another approach to doing it, which is kind of halfway in between. And I think that the things that are missing in computer graphics are the interaction with the actor or the scene, the behavior, the detail of no hairs because they don't go through the hair part, and then the organicness of the light and wind and things. So if you're taking something that is flying in no wind and you put it in a wind situation and it's flying like there's no wind, it doesn't work. And the reason, the downside to that is the people who are very good and who push computer and make money because they make computer graphics don't understand that stuff. And the rule of thumb in Hollywood is nobody will notice.
Right. I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson recounted a story where he told James Cameron, the director, that we know when the Titanic sank. So we know what the sky looked like in that portion of the world, and the sky was wrong. And James Cameron basically dismissed the comment as, would we have made $1 billion less? Or which is interesting, right? The attention to detail is important for some, or more important for some than others. Like Akira Kurosawa, famously or infamously, was very particular on sets. And with Seven Samurai, reportedly, if there were screws that were even off camera, he'd have the whole building taken down and set up again to match the period pieces that he desired, that he needed.
Well, I'll give you this one and you'll know it, and you'll know it really well. Watch any movie where they have rain and look in the background
Mm.
So you see the rain pouring in the front,
Yeah.
and you look in the background and the sun is shining, or there's no rain dripping off the roof.
Right.
It's pouring on the actor, but you look at the building across the street with the eaves and there's no rain coming off the eaves.
I suppose it depends on both the messenger and the receiver. So, as the messenger, the signaler, do you want to produce something that is utterly convincing to a subset of your audience, purely entertaining? Do you want to create a work that transcends the medium? And from the receiver's standpoint, what are your expectations? And of course, my expectations will be different than the non-entomologist portion of an
Well,
audience.
there's something I'm learning more and more. So the director films a film, and he turns in his cut. Okay, here's the film, and the studio looks at it and says, first, it's 10 minutes too long, and second, we don't like these cuts, so we're going to edit your film
Mhm.
because we're the studio. We put up the money, so we can do what we want. So that's why there's a director's cut and studio cut. And over again, the really bottom line is, and how many times have studios failed, um, where they say, this is what it is, and the movie bombs. They don't make any money. And I think the rule of thumb for studios is we're going to make 10 movies. 9 of them are going to fail, and one of them is going to make $1 billion.
Hmm.
And I think that's the philosophy they use. And it's about money.
Mhm.
You talk to people about creativity, and it isn't that. It's about money, and which is unfortunate. That's why if you make your own film or you do it on your own independently, you can do what you want. I you I would love to watch that scene with you, and you'll go, that's really good. Because I that was my feeling about that.